Hi guys, in today's video we're going to be learning how to calculate a percentage of a whole number using the fractions method. Now before you get started with this, you are going to need a bit of prior knowledge. To start with, it's really important that you have a good understanding of the relationship between fractions, decimals and percentages, particularly fractions and percentages. It's also really important that you know how to calculate fractions of a whole number. In other words, dividing by the bottom, multiplying by the top. Another thing that you will need to have a really good grip of is how to simplify fractions. And in this video, we're going to be using all of these skills. However, if you're confident with them, then by all means, let's get cracking with calculating percentages of a whole number using the fractions method. So what is a percentage, first of all? A percentage is basically just a fraction over 100. So if I take any number and split it up into 100 bits, then each one of those bits would be 1%. So for instance, let's say, just to start with an example, let's take the number 90. So our whole number here is 90. Now we want to split that into 100 tiny but equal bits. So if I take 90 and divide it into 100 tiny bits, then each one of these bits will be 0.9. So I'm going to split 90 into a lot of very small bits. In fact, 100 very small bits. And what I will get is 100 pieces of 0.9. That's an awful lot of 0.9, but when I add them all together, I will get the number 90. So 1% of 90 is 0.9. If I wanted 2%, well, what I would be talking about there is two parts of that. So each part on its own, 1% is 0.9, 2% is going to be two lots of that. If I wanted not 2%, but 10%, well then I'd be taking 10 of those pieces there. So all I'm basically doing is I'm dividing it by 100 and then taking some amount of that. So if it was 10%, I'd be taking 10 of those pieces. 20%, I'd be taking 20 of those pieces. 50%, I'd be taking 50 of those pieces, and so on and so forth. So, in this case, we're being asked to work out 20% of 60. So, 20% of 60. Well, what is 20% really? Well, what it is 20 hundredths of 60. So we can think of 20% as just being a fraction over 100. In other words, we're going to split 60 into 100 parts and then take 20 of them. So we would have a whole load of 0.6s, each one of them being 1%, and then I'm going to take 20 of them, which will be 20%. However, to me that sounds a bit complicated, because if I was to do that as a fraction, I'd have to divide by 100 and then times by 20. And that's needlessly complicated. Instead, what I see here is an opportunity to simplify a fraction. So, working this out then, 20 hundredths, I think we could simplify that quite a lot. We could simplify it to maybe 2/10 of 60. Now I've not simplified it all the way. I could have even simplified it to 1/5 of 60. But you know what? 2/10 will work fine. So 2/10 of 60. Well, that looks much more doable, doesn't it? What does this fraction tell us? It tells us that we take 60, we divide it by 10, and times it by 2. So let's try that. 2/10 of 60 divided by 10, that's 6, times 2, well that's going to be 12. So 20% of 60 then is quite simply 12. And we did that just by rewriting the percentage as a fraction and then simplifying it. So anytime you see any percentage, you just think about it not as being a percentage, but as being a fraction. And then if you can, simplify it and solve it. So let's look at another example then. 50% of 20. 50% is fairly well known. It's a half. But let's actually look at why. So we've been asked to work out 50% of 20. Well, what is 50%? Well, it's 50 hundredths of 20. Okay, now again, this is an opportunity to simplify. We could divide both of these by 10 and we'll get 5/10 of 20. However, even this we could simplify it further. Instead of 5/10, both of these are in the 5 times table, so what we're going to get is a half of 20. Now that is much easier to work out. We can easily work out half of 20. And quite simply, it's just 10. So 50%, when we see 50%, what we should be thinking is, well, that's actually 50 hundredths, and that is just the same as a half. So we can use our knowledge of fractions and how to simplify them to then work out a percentage of a number. Okay, 25% of 80 this time. Right, well, let's go through this one. So 25% of 80. Well, again, this just needs to be written over 100. 25 hundredths of 80. So, I could think about this as dividing 80 by 100, so into 100 tiny little bits of 0.8, and then taking 25 of them. However, I think once again we can simplify this fraction. So I could simplify this using the 5 times table, for example. So how many 5s make 25? 5 of them. How many 5s make 100? 20 of them. So it's actually just 5/20ths of 80, which is a bit more achievable, but even then this could be simplified further. Basically we want to make this as simple as possible. So how many 5s are in 5? 1 of them. How many 5s are in 20? 4 of them. So what this is really asking us is just a quarter of 80. And you know what? When we look at it this way, it makes complete sense. Because 25%, if I was to take 25 of these pieces here, what fraction of the shape am I taking? Well, I'm taking a quarter of it. That is a quarter of this percentage board here. So 0.8, 0.8, 0.8, I've got 25 of them here. Each one's 1%. So 25% then is just 25 hundredths, which really is just a quarter. So 10% this time. Well, let's skip a stage here. We'll just write it out straight away as a fraction. So it's really just 10 hundredths. And it's of 90 this time. So, again, I could divide it into 100 little pieces of 1% if I wanted. And again, this takes a long time to do it that way, and there's easier ways of doing it, but I could think of each one of these as just being 1%. And then I'm going to take 10 of them here. So 10% is going to be, well, dividing it by 100, then timesing it by 10. However, easier, once again, is to think, can I simplify this? And the answer is yes. How do we simplify this? Well, these are both in the 10 times table. So it's really just a tenth of 90. What is a tenth of 90? Well, that is just 9. So 10% of 90 just equals 9. And we work it out because 10% is just 10 hundredths, but then simplified that becomes a tenth. Another quick one then. So 75% is 75 hundredths, and we're working it out of 32. So this time we've got 0.32 this time. So every 1% is 0.32. So that means that I could just divide 32 by 100 and then times it by 75. But again, that would just be a little bit needlessly complicated. Instead, 75%, again, we can simplify it. So 75% of 32, well, we can simplify this using our 25 times table. We could do other times tables and do it gradually, but for the sake of speed, let's just do our 25 times table. So how many 25s are there in 75? Well, that's 3. How many 25s are there in 100? Well, that's 4. So really what we're being asked to work out is 3/4 of 32. So in that case, we take 32, we divide it by 4, and then we're going to times our answer by 3. So 32 divided by 4, that's 8, times it by 3, and we get the answer 24. So 75% of 32 is really just asking us 3/4 of 32, the answer to which is 24. And again, you can see why when we highlight what 75% looks like. If I take 75% of this, we should see that that is the same as just 3/4. So 75% and 3/4 is exactly the same thing. So if I have 75% of something, I have 3/4 of it. Now, this final example then is a little bit more complicated because, quite simply, not all percentages can be simplified. So we're being asked to work out 17% of 90. Well, that means that we're taking 90, we're splitting it up into 100 parts, and then we're timesing it by 17. And there is no simpler way to do it, unfortunately. There is no way of simplifying this fraction. So unfortunately, we do just need to divide by 100 and times by 17. So if we're doing 90 divided by 100, we're going to get 0.9, and then we're going to have to multiply that by 17. And just doing this on a calculator, what we get is 15.3. So basically, if I take 17 of these, it will add up to 15.3. So that's all percentages are. We basically, in the most simple of cases, divide by 100 and then times by whatever the percentage is. But in many cases, such as 25%, 50%, 75%, and 10%, we can just use different fractions in order to make our working out that little bit easier. So there you go. That is how to work out percentages using the fractions method. Basically, simplify the fraction as much as you can, then divide by the bottom, times by the top. Cheers, guys!